The floorboards groaned above me, a rhythmic creak. I was huddled in the pantry, dust motes dancing in the sliver of moonlight filtering through the crack under the door. Every fiber of my being screamed that I needed to move, to run, but the sound was directly overhead, and I knew it was coming for me. It had been watching, waiting, ever since I'd noticed the small, almost imperceptible signs that indicated I wasn't alone. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and something else, something ancient and decaying, clinging to the shadows of this old cabin rental. I pressed my palm against my mouth, trying to stifle the ragged breaths that threatened to give away my position. They knew I was here. It all started 3 months ago, when I decided I needed to get away. I was burnt out, utterly fried by city life and a particularly grueling project at work. My therapist suggested a change of scenery, somewhere quiet, somewhere I could truly disconnect. Browsing online, I stumbled upon a listing for an old cabin rental nestled deep in the Catskill Mountains. The pictures showed a rustic, somewhat dilapidated wooden cabin surrounded by dense trees with a small creek running nearby. It looked perfect, secluded, cheap, and far away from any Wi-Fi signals or demanding clients. The rental agency was surprisingly professional for such a remote property, even had a decent online booking system, though the pictures, as I'd soon discover, were clearly outdated. I booked it for a month, packed a single duffel bag, and drove out, eager for the solitude. The drive itself was a journey into tranquility. The asphalt roads gave way to gravel, then to a winding dirt path barely wide enough for my car. The trees grew taller, denser, their branches interlocking overhead to form a cool, shaded tunnel. When I finally reached the cabin, late in the afternoon, the sun was already dipping below the highest peaks, casting long, eerie shadows across the forest floor. The cabin was exactly as advertised, perhaps a little more weathered in person. The paint was peeling, the porch sagged slightly, and a few windows were boarded up, but it possessed a certain charm, an echo of simpler times. A sense of peace washed over me, a feeling that I had finally found what I was looking for. I spent the first few days simply existing. I read books, hiked the nearby trails, cooked simple meals on the ancient gas stove, and listened to the ceaseless symphony of the forest. The only sounds were the wind rustling through the leaves, the chirping of crickets, and the distant murmur of the creek. It was exactly what I needed. My phone had no signal, which was a blessing, forcing me to truly unplug. The cabin itself was sparsely furnished but comfortable. A lumpy couch, a sturdy wooden table, and a surprisingly comfortable bed in the single bedroom. There was a small, crudely carved wooden figure on the mantelpiece, almost hidden by a stack of old books. It looked like a hunched, vaguely human shape, with uncomfortably deep-set eyes. I thought it was just rustic decor, a local craft piece, and didn't pay it much mind other than noting its unusual details. This humble relic would later serve as a disturbing precursor to the horrors I was about to confront. The first subtle signs that something was amiss began a week into my stay. Nothing overt, nothing that would immediately trigger alarm bells. Just tiny, almost imperceptible anomalies that I initially dismissed. I'd wake up some mornings and find a kitchen cabinet slightly ajar that I swore I had closed the night before. Or a book I'd left on the bedside table would be on the floor, as if it had simply slipped, even though the floor was level. I'd shrug it off, attributing it to my own forgetfulness, the quirks of an old house settling, or perhaps the vibrations from some animal scuttling across the roof. The occasional creaks and groans of the timber structure were constant, a normal soundtrack for such an aged dwelling. It didn't occur to me that these seemingly benign events were the early breadcrumbs of a trail leading to a much more sinister presence. One afternoon, I returned from a long hike, feeling refreshed and invigorated. As I unlocked the front door, a heavy wooden slab with a rusted iron bolt, I noticed a faint, earthy smell. It was distinct, not the usual damp aroma of an old cabin, but something stronger, like freshly turned soil mixed with something metallic. I paused, sniffing the air, then shook my head. Perhaps a burrowing animal had gotten under the floorboards, or the recent rain had churned up some mud. I kicked off my muddy boots and made my way to the kitchen for a glass of water. That's when I noticed it. The small ceramic mug I always used, which I'd carefully washed and placed on the drying rack that morning, was now sitting on the kitchen table. It was empty, but perfectly centered, as if someone had just finished drinking from it and set it down. My heart gave a little lurch. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the mug. I distinctly remembered putting it away. I was meticulous about tidying up, especially in a rented space. Was I just imagining things? Was my mind playing tricks on me, still craving the chaos of city life and fabricating small mysteries? I picked up the mug, examining it. It felt cool to the touch, and there was no condensation, no sign that anything had been recently in it. I told myself it must have been me. I must have set it there absent-mindedly and then forgotten. My brain was clearly still in recovery mode. This was a new environment, far from the concrete jungle, and my senses were probably on overdrive, making connections where there were none. I tried to rationalize it, but a tiny seed of unease had been planted. The next few days saw a continuation of these minor, unsettling events. A window I was sure I had latched would be slightly ajar, letting in a draft. A chair would be pulled out from the kitchen table just a fraction, as if someone had just stood up. I started to develop a habit of mentally noting the position of everyday objects, a silent challenge to my own deteriorating memory. I found myself constantly checking over my shoulder, blaming it on my city-bred paranoia. Was it just the wind playing tricks, or was that actually a whisper I heard just beyond the edge of hearing when the cabin was otherwise perfectly silent? I started sleeping with a small, battery-powered lantern on the bedside table, just in case the power, supplied by an ancient generator, decided to sputter out. It wasn't a fear of the dark exactly, more a vague apprehension of what might be in the dark, in this unfamiliar, secluded space. One evening, as I was reading by the light of the same lantern, a peculiar sound drifted from the living room. It wasn't a creak, or a groan, or the wind. It was a soft, rhythmic scratching, like nails on wood, coming from the old, sealed-off fireplace. I set my book down, my breath catching in my throat. I listened intently. Scratch, scratch, scratch. It was faint but definite. My mind immediately jumped to rodents, perhaps a squirrel or a bat trapped in the chimney. I knew old cabins were prone to such things. I picked up a walking stick I kept by the door and cautiously approached the fireplace. The scratching stopped abruptly as I got closer. I waited, holding my breath, straining my ears. Nothing. Only the steady hum of insects outside and the thumping of my own heart. I prodded the bricks with the stick, listened again. Silence. It was almost as if whatever was making the noise knew I was there. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, that the quiet of the cabin was making me hypersensitive to every little sound. I returned to my book, but the words blurred on the page. The peaceful solitude I had sought was slowly transforming into something else, something less comforting. I found myself checking the locks on the doors more often, peering out the windows into the impenetrable darkness of the forest. I started to feel less like a guest in the cabin and more like I was intruding on something, on someone. The idea of a forgotten visitor began to take root in my mind, a chilling thought that I quickly pushed away. There was no one else here. There couldn't be. This was my escape, my solitude. Yet, the subtle shifts in the cabin's order, the fleeting smells, the phantom sounds, all began to coalesce into an undeniable pattern. A pattern that suggested I was not, and perhaps had never been, truly alone in this seemingly deserted mountain retreat. The next morning, the creeping sense of being watched escalated from a nagging feeling to a palpable presence. I woke up with a vague sense of unease. The air in the bedroom felt heavy, and I shivered despite the warmth of my blankets. As my eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering through the window, I noticed something new. On the small, rough-hewn bedside table, right next to where I usually placed my glasses, was a small pile of pebbles, 3 perfectly smooth, gray stones, arranged in a neat triangle. I didn't collect pebbles. I hadn't brought any into the cabin. My stomach clenched. This wasn't a forgotten mug or a slightly ajar cabinet. This was deliberate, a message. A cold dread began to seep into my bones. I frantically searched the room, under the bed, in the closet, behind the old chest of drawers. Nothing. No sign of entry, no broken window, no forced lock. The cabin was exactly as I had left it last night, except for the unnerving arrangement of stones. My mind raced, trying to find a logical explanation. Had a small animal somehow dragged them in? Unlikely, given their size and placement. Had I sleepwalked? I never had before. The only conclusion I could draw, the one my rational mind fought against, was that someone or something had been in my room while I slept. I picked up the pebbles, their smoothness chilling against my fingertips, and tossed them out the window, hoping to rid myself of the unsettling discovery. I then double-checked every window and door, jamming a chair under the doorknob for good measure. The cabin, once a haven of peace, now felt like a cage. Every shadow seemed to hold a secret, every creak of the floorboards a warning. I started to talk to myself, not out of loneliness, but to hear a human voice in the oppressive silence. I tried to focus on my reading, on my hiking, but my senses were on high alert. I was constantly listening, watching, straining to catch a glimpse of whatever it was that was sharing this old cabin rental with me. My sleep became fractured, punctuated by sudden awakenings, convinced I heard movement outside my bedroom door, or the soft rustle of leaves directly beneath my window, even on windless nights. The small, crudely carved wooden figure on the mantelpiece, which I had earlier dismissed as mere decor, now seemed to mock me with its vacant, deep-set eyes, observing my growing paranoia. It was as if this silent observer held the key to the cabin's secrets, a silent, grim reminder of a forgotten visitor. One rainy afternoon, confined indoors, I decided to explore the cabin more thoroughly. Perhaps there was a logical explanation for everything, a hidden crawl space, a secret entrance. I started in the living room, running my hands along the rough-hewn walls, tapping on the paneling. That's when I found it. Behind a faded landscape painting, hung crookedly over what looked like an old, sealed-off doorway, the wall felt different. Not solid wood, but lighter, almost hollow. I carefully pried the painting off its hook. Beneath it, the wood paneling was indeed lighter, newer than the surrounding timber and slightly recessed. It was clearly a patch job, hastily done. My heart pounded. This was more than just an old cabin settling. This was a deliberate concealment. I found a rusty screwdriver in the toolbox by the generator shed and began to carefully pry at the edges of the newer paneling. It was nailed in tightly, but with persistence, a small gap appeared. Through the gap, I peered into darkness. The air that wafted out was stagnant, heavy with the earthy, metallic scent I had noticed before, but much stronger now, almost suffocating. It was also incredibly cold, as if the room beyond existed in a different climate entirely. I widened the gap, pulling away more of the rough boards until I could finally squeeze my head through. What I saw sent a chill straight to my bones, a cold that had nothing to do with the temperature. It was a small, dusty room, no windows, barely enough space to stand up straight, and it was clearly not empty. In the center of the room, on a low, wooden platform, lay a crude, makeshift mattress. It was stained and tattered, covered with what looked like dried leaves and twigs. Scattered around it were various objects. An old, rusted tin cup, a stack of worn-out, mud-caked boots, and a collection of smooth, gray pebbles, identical to the ones that had appeared on my bedside table. My blood ran cold. This wasn't a crawl space. This was a hidden chamber, a room where someone had been living, and not recently, but for a long time. The dust was thick, layered over everything, suggesting it hadn't been entered in years, perhaps decades. Was this the forgotten visitor? We're about to go deeper into this, and the story only gets darker from here. If you're enjoying this account and want to support the channel, take a quick moment to like the video and subscribe. It helps more than you know. Now let's get back to it. The implications hit me like a physical blow. Someone had lived here, in this tiny, secret space, hidden behind a false wall in my old cabin rental. And the objects, the pebbles, they suggested a connection, a continued presence even after their physical departure. I backed out of the opening, my hands shaking. I needed to understand. What kind of person lived like this, and why? I was gripped by a morbid curiosity, coupled with an escalating terror. I began searching the rest of the cabin with renewed urgency, not just for signs of a current occupant, but for clues to who this forgotten visitor was. In a dusty corner of the main living area, tucked away behind a stack of old firewood, I found a small, leather-bound journal. It was ancient, its pages brittle and yellowed, the writing faded but still legible. It was a diary filled with erratic, almost frantic entries detailing a life of isolation, of watching, of waiting. The entries spanned decades, dating back to before the cabin was even listed for rent. The author, who never explicitly named themselves, wrote about the others, the people who would occasionally come to their cabin, unaware of the true owner. It spoke of resentment, of feeling displaced, of a desperate need to reclaim what was theirs. The language grew increasingly disjointed over time, filled with references to gifts left for the unsuspecting guests and a chilling satisfaction in their fear. My hands trembled as I read. This wasn't just some historical oddity. This was the account of someone who had lived in this cabin, hidden from the world, observing every guest, every tenant. The pebbles, the moved objects, the scratching in the fireplace. It wasn't a ghost. It was the lingering shadow of a deeply disturbed individual who had once called this secret room home. And the journal ended abruptly, decades ago, with a final chilling entry. They are coming. I must hide, but I will always be here, always watching. This is my cabin. The terror was no longer ambiguous. It was concrete. The cabin had a history, a dark undercurrent of a forgotten visitor, an anonymous presence that had claimed it long before any rental agency ever did. The journal didn't provide closure. It only intensified the fear. It didn't explain where this person went, only that they would always be here. I reread the last entry, my breath catching in my throat. Had they died in that hidden room? Or had they simply moved on, leaving an imprint of their madness behind? The thought that this disturbed individual had perhaps never truly left, that their spirit or even their physical self might still be present, hidden somewhere else within the structure or the surrounding wilderness, was unbearable. The solitude I had craved had become a horrifying trap, and I was utterly alone, far from any help, with a legacy of unsettling surveillance and a palpable sense of a continuing presence in this old cabin rental. The realization that the forgotten visitor wasn't just a historical curiosity, but a persistent, malevolent energy living on through the very fabric of the old cabin rental was a turning point. The journal had made it clear. This was their home, and I was an intruder. I didn't know if I was dealing with a spirit, a deeply ingrained psychological imprint, or something far more tangible and sinister that had been lying dormant. My initial fear morphed into a primal need to escape, but first I had to survive until morning. The sun had already set, plunging the forest into an inky blackness that seemed to press against the cabin's thin walls. I boarded up the hidden room again, more frantically this time, hammering the panels back into place with desperate, trembling hands. It felt like I was trying to seal away a gaping wound, but the truth was, the wound was already festering within the cabin itself. I checked every lock, every window more than once, then twice, then a third time. I piled furniture against the doors, creating barricades that felt flimsy and pathetic against the chilling narrative I had just consumed. The small, crudely carved wooden figure on the mantelpiece seemed to grin at me in the dim light, its hollow eyes reflecting the depths of my terror. It was no longer just decor. It felt like a sentinel, a silent witness to generations of unwelcome guests. That night was a descent into pure, unadulterated terror. Every shadow danced, every creak echoed like a gunshot. I sat on the living room floor, a heavy iron poker clutched in my hand, staring at the front door. The sounds began subtly, as they always did. A soft tap on the window pane, like a fingernail gently scraping glass. I froze, my eyes wide, straining to see through the reflections on the dark glass. Nothing. Then, a distinct rustle from the attic access panel in the ceiling directly above the living room. It wasn't the wind. It was too rhythmic, too intentional. Scritch, scritch, scritch. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the oppressive silence. I didn't dare look up. I knew what was up there. Something that had lingered, something that had claimed this cabin long ago. The journal had painted a disturbing picture of an individual obsessed with their domain, a mind warped by isolation and perceived injustice. My imagination, fueled by the unsettling account, conjured grotesque images of what might be lurking just beyond my sight. Was it a physical presence, grown feral and distorted by years of solitude? Or was it something more ethereal, a phantom born of deep-seated resentment? The ambiguity was almost worse than knowing. Then came the footsteps. Slow, deliberate, heavy footsteps directly above me in the attic. Thump, drag, thump, drag. They weren't light, scuttling sounds of an animal. These were the unmistakable sounds of something large, something with weight, moving ponderously across the floorboards. My blood ran cold, solidifying in my veins. Whatever it was no mere memory or echo. It was here now. It was aware of me. The pause between each step seemed to stretch into an eternity, each one bringing it closer to the attic access. I could almost feel the vibrations through the ceiling. I whimpered, a small, pathetic sound that died in my throat. I squeezed my eyes shut, wishing it was all a dream, a nightmare born of exhaustion and an overactive imagination. But the sounds were undeniably real. The rhythmic creak drag creak from the cold open, the one I experienced every time I'd try to sleep, was now above me, moving with terrifying slowness. I realized with a sickening jolt that it wasn't just moving in the attic, it was moving towards the access panel, towards me. I scrambled backwards, knocking over a chair, my heart leaping into my throat. The footsteps stopped. The cabin fell silent, a deadly, suffocating silence. I held my breath, listening, my ears ringing with the absence of sound. Was it gone? Had it heard me? Then a new sound, far more chilling, emerged. A soft, guttural breathing, like a choked gasp, coming from directly above the attic hatch. It was slow, ragged, and undeniably close. It smelled the air, or so it seemed, searching for me. My last shred of reason screamed at me to get out, to run, no matter what. I scrambled to my feet, my legs wobbly from fear, and fumbled for the heavy wooden bolt on the front door. The barricade of furniture made it a desperate struggle. Just as my fingers wrapped around the cold metal of the bolt, a loud, splintering crack came from the attic. The wooden access panel vibrated violently, a thin stream of dust raining down. I didn't wait. I yanked the bolt back, threw the door open, ignoring the resistance of the piled chairs, and burst out into the night. I didn't look back. I just ran. My bare feet pounded on the rough ground, ignoring the sharp stones and mud. The cold night air whipped against my face, but I barely felt it. All I could hear was the frantic thump of my own heart and the phantom sound of heavy, dragging footsteps, echoing behind me through the impenetrable darkness of the forest. I ran until my lungs burned, until my legs gave out, until I collapsed beside my car, half hidden by a thicket of ferns. I fumbled for my car keys, my hands shaking so violently I could barely insert the key into the ignition. I started the engine, threw the car into reverse, and sped down the winding dirt path, not caring if I hit a tree. All I cared about was getting as far away from that old cabin rental as humanly possible. I glanced in the rearview mirror once, just once, and through the swaying trees, I thought I saw a faint, distorted shape standing on the cabin's porch, silhouetted against the dark facade. It was tall, hunched, and utterly still, watching me flee. A final, chilling confirmation that the forgotten visitor was indeed still there. I drove all night, not stopping until the first rays of dawn touched the horizon, illuminating a gas station sign miles away from the mountains. I collapsed into a cheap motel room, physically and emotionally drained, but the image of that hunched figure on the porch, the memory of the breathing above me, the profound sense of a continuous, unseen presence remained etched into my mind. I never reported the incident. What would I say? That I was terrorized by a forgotten visitor in an old cabin rental, a presence outlined in an antique journal. They would think I was insane. I simply told the rental agency that the cabin was uninhabitable and I was cutting my stay short. They didn't question it, processing my refund without a fuss. The experience at that cabin changed me. Sleep no longer comes easy. Every creak of my own apartment building, every unseen shadow, sends a jolt of fear through me. I sometimes catch myself checking under the bed or peering over my shoulder, convinced that something is still watching. I still have the image of that small, crudely carved wooden figure in my mind, its deep-set eyes seeming to see straight through me. I'm haunted by the thought that the forgotten visitor isn't confined to that remote cabin, but a lingering presence, a malevolent energy that somehow attached itself to me. I survived the encounter, but I didn't escape unscathed. The silence I once craved now feels like a prelude to something far more terrifying. I am constantly aware of the unseen, always wondering if that particular old cabin rental will ever truly be empty, or if its forgotten visitor will simply wait for the next unsuspecting guest. Unsettling wind down. It's been months since I left that cabin behind, but the cabin hasn't left me. The quiet moments, once so soothing, are now ripe with a different kind of tension, a silent expectation. I used to crave the peace of solitude. Now it feels isolating, a void just waiting to be filled by the echo of heavy footsteps, the phantom scent of earth and decay. My dreams are a fractured landscape of dimly lit rooms, hidden passages, and the constant, crushing knowledge that I am being watched. I see those deep-set eyes of the wooden figure in the corner of my vision, hear the soft, ragged breathing just beyond the threshold of sleep. I sometimes wonder about the next person who might stumble upon that remote listing, drawn in by the promise of escape, just as I was. Do they feel it too, that subtle shift in the air, the unexplainable movement of objects? Or do they dismiss it until the quiet whispers turn into undeniable thumps, until the unseen presence makes itself known? I never told anyone the full story, not really. How could I articulate the profound wrongness of it all, the feeling of being hunted by something ancient and consumed by resentment? The experience carved a hollow space inside me, a permanent void where trust and tranquility once resided. I am a survivor, but the scars are invisible, constantly itching, reminding me that some doors once opened can never truly be closed, and some visitors truly forgotten never really leave. If any of you have experienced something similar, a sense of an unseen presence in a place that should have been yours alone, I invite you to share your stories in the comments below. Perhaps in sharing, we can find some small comfort in knowing we are not truly alone in our fear.